Did you like the ring? My daughter asked casually, as if she were asking whether I wanted more coffee. I paused with the paper gift bag still in my hands. What ring? I said. The room went quiet for half a second. Not silent, just thinner, like the air had been pulled out and pushed back in too fast. The one we gave Mom, she replied. For Mother's Day, the diamond ring and the cruise. I looked up at her then. Really looked. She wasn't facing me. She was smiling toward the other end of the table, where her mother-in-law sat, fingers already decorated with a large stone that caught the light every time she moved her hand. A $40,000 ring, I would later learn. Caribbean cruise. Balcony suite. 7 nights. I'm glad to have you here, I said quietly, more out of habit than intention. Stay with me until the end, and if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from. No one seemed to notice I'd spoken. It was Mother's Day. Brunch at their house. White tablecloth. Fresh flowers from the grocery store, still in their plastic sleeves under the sink. The smell of eggs and bacon hung in the air, familiar and heavy. I had arrived early, as I always did, helped set the table, folded the napkins the way I'd taught my daughter years ago. I was seated at the corner of the table, not the head, not across from anyone, just there. They passed gifts around after the plates were cleared. Laughter. Phones out for photos. Someone said, "This is perfect," and meant it. When it was my turn, my daughter slid a small bag across the table toward me. Light. Almost empty. I thanked her. I always thank her. Inside was a plastic keychain. Pink. Shiny. Still had the price tag on it. $9.99. I smiled. I didn't open my mouth. I didn't ask a single question. That's important to understand. I didn't react the way people expect. I held the bag in my lap while they talked about the cruise itinerary. Ports. Excursions. How excited her mother-in-law was to finally be spoiled for once. I nodded when someone glanced my way. I even laughed when the joke came around again. But something had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. I had raised my daughter mostly on my own. Her father worked long hours. I handled everything else. School forms, doctor visits, late-night fevers. College applications spread across the kitchen table with cold coffee and highlighters. I paid for her first car. Helped with the down payment on her house, watched her children when daycare fell through, never kept track, never asked for anything in return. I didn't think love worked that way. As I sat there that morning, holding a plastic keychain while another woman admired a diamond, I began replaying moments I'd brushed aside before. Birthdays where plans changed last minute, holidays where I was asked to come later, the way decisions were made without me, then explained afterward. I had told myself it was nothing, that families grow, that roles change. But that morning, something became very clear. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was priority. I didn't confront anyone. I finished my coffee. I hugged my grandchildren. I said thank you again before I left. On the drive home, the radio played softly. I didn't turn it off. I didn't cry. I just thought about how long I'd been giving without noticing where I stood. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never allowed before. What happens when I stop? When I got home, I placed the keychain on the kitchen counter and didn't move it. My house was quiet in the way it always was now. No television, no children's voices, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the sink. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the small table by the window, the same table where I used to help my daughter with spelling words and later with resumes. The keychain stayed where it was. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. I had expected anger, tears maybe. Instead, there was a kind of dull clarity, like when a headache finally settles into something manageable. You stop fighting it. You just notice it. I thought about the drive over that morning, how I'd stopped at the drugstore to buy a card. I'd stood there longer than I should have, reading messages written by strangers about appreciation and gratitude. I chose one that felt neutral, safe. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. I set the card beside the flowers I'd brought, flowers I'd paid for myself. That afternoon, my phone buzzed once. A photo. The ring, up close. Her mother-in-law's hand held out toward the camera, nails freshly done. The diamond caught the sunlight. The caption read, "Best Mother's Day ever." I didn't respond. I made myself a sandwich I didn't finish. I rinsed the plate and put it in the dishwasher, even though it was the only dish inside. I moved through the house slowly, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in a while. A loose cabinet hinge, a stack of mail I hadn't opened, a sweater my daughter had left behind months ago, still folded on the guest bed. I sat down and opened the mail. Utility bills, a flyer, a bank statement. I'd always been careful with money. Not frugal in a way that made life small, but cautious, thoughtful. I wanted to be able to help when help was needed, and help had been needed, often. Childcare here. A short-term loan there. I'd never said no. Looking at the numbers on the page, I realized something else. No one had asked me for anything in a while. They hadn't needed to. They'd already decided where I fit. That evening, I reheated leftovers and ate standing up at the counter. I watched the sun go down through the kitchen window, the sky turning the same pale orange it always did. I wondered how many Mother's Days I'd spent making meals, wrapping gifts, planning gatherings, telling myself that being needed was enough. I didn't feel needed anymore, and strangely, that brought relief. Later that night, I picked up the keychain again. It was lighter than I remembered. Cheap plastic. I turned it over in my hand once, then placed it in the junk drawer with old batteries and mismatched keys. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. Before bed, I wrote down a list. Nothing dramatic, just names and dates. Times I'd rearranged my life to be available. Times I'd said yes without being asked. The list wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. As I turned off the light, one thought stayed with me, steady and calm. I had been generous because I believed I belonged. Now that belief was gone. And without it, I was free to decide what came next. The next few days passed without anything unusual happening. That in itself felt unusual. No calls asking if I could watch the kids. No quick texts about a school pickup or a forgotten lunch. No last-minute favors. My phone stayed quiet on the kitchen counter, face up, as if daring me to notice. I noticed. On Wednesday morning, I drove to the grocery store. Same route I'd taken for years. Same parking spot if it was open. I pushed the cart slowly down the aisles, picking up only what I needed. Milk, bread, soup. I skipped the snacks my grandchildren liked. I paused, then moved on. At the checkout, the cashier asked, "Quiet week?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it in more than one way. That afternoon, my daughter finally called. Her voice sounded normal, light, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, Mom," she said, just checking in. I leaned against the counter and waited. She didn't apologize. She didn't mention Sunday. She talked about traffic, about work, about how tired she was. I listened. Then she said, "I might need your help next week. We're planning something and I won't be available," I said. The line went silent. "What do you mean?" she asked, a small edge creeping into her voice. "I have plans," I said. That was true. I just hadn't shared them yet. There was a pause, longer this time. "Since when?" "Since now." She laughed once, short and uncertain. "Okay, well, we'll figure something out." After we hung up, my hands were steady. That surprised me too. Later that evening, I opened a photo album I hadn't looked at in years. Not on my phone. A real one. Thick pages. Corners peeling. Pictures from when my daughter was small. Halloween costumes I'd sewn myself. School plays where I'd sat in the front row, camera ready. I remembered standing in the rain at soccer games, packing lunches at midnight, staying up all night before exams just in case she needed help. I had been there for everything. What I hadn't done was ask where I stood now. On Friday, I received another photo. This time, the cruise brochure. A message followed, "Can you believe how lucky she is?" I didn't respond. That night, I went through my calendar. I crossed out dates, not angrily, carefully. The recurring babysitting nights, the standing Sunday dinners I always hosted. I left the spaces blank. The empty squares felt honest. Over the weekend, I ran into a neighbor who asked how my Mother's Day had been. "It was quiet," I said. She smiled. "Sometimes quiet is good." I nodded. It was. By Sunday evening, my daughter texted again, shorter this time. "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "Yes." That was all. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't making a point out loud. I was simply stepping back far enough to see the shape of things clearly. And what I saw was this. I had been present for years without being prioritized, reliable without being valued, convenient without being considered. That realization didn't break me. It settled me. I turned off my phone and placed it in the drawer beside the keychain. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that no longer felt empty. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to notice my absence. I was noticing myself. On Monday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still dark, the kind of dark that feels settled rather than heavy. I made coffee and stood by the sink, watching steam rise from the mug. For years, mornings like this meant preparing for someone else's needs. Lunches, drop-offs, a mental list of favors I might be asked for before noon. That morning, there was no list. I sat down with the notebook I'd started days earlier, the one with names and dates. I added more, slowly, carefully. Not just the big moments, but the small ones that had quietly shaped my role in the family. The weekends I canceled plans because someone else forgot theirs. The vacations I postponed because childcare was too complicated. The way I was always described as so understanding. I had mistaken flexibility for connection. Around mid-morning, my daughter called again. This time, her tone was different. Less casual. More cautious. "Mom," she said, "everything okay?" "You seem distant." I didn't answer right away. I looked around my kitchen. The clean counters. The calendar with blank spaces where obligations used to live. "I'm fine," I said. She sighed. "Did we do something wrong?" That question stayed with me after we hung up. Not because I felt the need to answer it for her, but because I finally answered it for myself. They hadn't done one thing wrong. They had done many small things consistently, quietly, over time. I thought back to a birthday years ago when plans changed last minute, and I was told it would be easier if I stayed home. A Thanksgiving, when my role was to arrive early, leave late, and not be in the photos. Christmas mornings spent cleaning wrapping paper while everyone else sat down. At the time, I told myself it was normal, that this was what mothers did. But motherhood was never meant to erase a person. That afternoon, I drove past my daughter's neighborhood without stopping. I noticed how light the car felt without bags in the back seat. No booster seats, no emergency snacks. I stopped at a park instead, sat on a bench, watched a woman about my age walk with a friend, laughing, unhurried, unapologetic. It occurred to me then that I had spent years making myself smaller to fit into a role no one had formally given me, but everyone expected me to fill. When I got home, there was a message waiting. "We're finalizing plans for next month. Can you confirm availability?" I read it twice. Then I deleted it. Not angrily, not dramatically, just deliberately. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself. A full meal, not leftovers. I ate at the table instead of standing at the counter. I didn't rush. I didn't clean immediately after. Later, I folded laundry that had been sitting untouched for days. I realized how often I delayed my own tasks because someone else needed me first. Before bed, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I noticed lines I'd ignored, strength I hadn't acknowledged. A woman who had carried more than she'd ever been credited for, and had done it quietly. I wasn't invisible. I had simply been standing where no one was looking. That night, my phone buzzed once more. A short message. "Let me know when you're ready to talk." I placed the phone face down. I was ready to talk, just not on the terms I used to accept. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. By midweek, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. No one asked how I was doing. No one mentioned Mother's Day again. The silence around it felt intentional, like an agreement everyone had made without inviting me into the room. On Thursday afternoon, my sister called. We hadn't spoken in a while. She lives 3 states away, but she hears things. She always has. "I didn't want to bring this up," she said carefully, "but I saw the photos. I didn't ask which ones. She looks happy," my sister continued. "The ring, the cruise, it's a lot." "Yes," I said, "it is." There was a pause. Then quietly, "Do you know they've been planning that trip for months?" I closed my eyes. "No," I said, and I meant more than the trip. "They talked about it back in February," she went on. "Your daughter mentioned how important it was to make her feel appreciated, her exact words." I thanked her for calling. We talked about other things after that. Weather, health, nothing important. But after we hung up, I sat very still. February. That was the same month my daughter asked if I could help cover a few unexpected expenses, just until things settled. I'd written the check without hesitation, like always. That evening, I took out my bank statements again. I didn't panic. I didn't feel regret. I simply looked, line by line, dates, amounts, patterns don't shout, they repeat. I realized then that generosity, when expected, becomes invisible. And invisibility has a cost. On Friday, my daughter stopped by unannounced. She stood in the doorway, keys still in her hand, like she wasn't sure she'd come inside. "You've been hard to reach," she said. "I've been home," I replied. She looked around, as if something might explain the difference she felt. The calm, the order, the absence of urgency. "We're just worried about you," she added. I nodded. I didn't invite her to sit. She shifted her weight. "You know the gift wasn't meant to hurt you." "I know," I said. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. She waited, maybe for reassurance, maybe for me to say it was fine, that I understood, that I always would. I said nothing. After she left, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Old documents, notes, a folded letter from my late husband written before he passed. He'd always worried about me giving too much, about me being taken for granted. I hadn't listened then. I listened now. That night, I slept deeply. No rehearsed conversations. No imagined apologies. Just rest. In the morning, I made a decision. A quiet one. I updated my calendar. I adjusted my finances. I set boundaries without announcing them. Not as punishment, as clarity. Because understanding finally settled in where confusion used to live. I hadn't lost my place in the family overnight. I had slowly been moved. And once I saw that clearly, I knew something else just as clearly. I didn't need to fight to be valued. I needed to stop proving my worth to people who had already decided what it cost. The following week unfolded more slowly than I expected, without the constant pull of obligations, time stretched in unfamiliar ways. Mornings were quieter, afternoons longer. I began to notice how often I'd lived on someone else's schedule, responding instead of choosing. On Tuesday, my daughter called again. This time, she didn't ease into it. "We need to talk," she said. I was folding towels. I finished the one in my hands before answering. "About what?" "You know what?" she replied. "Things feel off." "They are," I said. She exhaled sharply. "I don't understand why you're pulling away." I leaned against the counter and waited. She filled the silence quickly. "You've always been there, and now suddenly you're not. It feels unfair." Unfair. I thought about the word for a moment. "I didn't go anywhere," I said. "I just stopped stepping forward." That stopped her. Later that afternoon, I met an old friend for coffee. Someone who had known me before I became only mom or grandma. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You seem lighter," she said. "I feel clearer," I replied. She smiled. "Those are not the same thing." She was right. When I got home, there was an email waiting. A long one, carefully written, explaining intentions, justifying choices, telling me how much I was appreciated, even if it hadn't come across that way. I read it once, then I closed it. Not because it wasn't sincere, but because it came too late to change what I'd already understood. That evening, I opened the drawer with the keychain again. I held it briefly, then placed it back. It no longer made me feel anything. Not sadness, not anger, just neutrality. I realized then that the turning point hadn't been Mother's Day. It had been what came after. The expectation that I would smooth things over, that I would reassure everyone, that I would accept an explanation instead of an experience. For years, I had confused peacekeeping with love. On Thursday, my daughter stopped by again. This time, she sat down without being invited. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "But?" she asked. "But intention doesn't erase impact," I said. She nodded slowly as if hearing it for the first time. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. I met her eyes. Neither do I. And that was the truth. Because fixing it would require something neither of us could undo. Not the ring, not the cruise, but the pattern that had formed long before either of those existed. After she left, I went for a walk. The air was cool. Leaves had started to change. I noticed how steady my steps felt, how unhurried. I wasn't waiting anymore. That night, I wrote one final note in my notebook. Not a list, just a sentence. I am not withdrawing. I am redefining. I slept well. And when I woke up the next morning, I knew something important had shifted. Not in my family, in me. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my worth by how needed I was. I was measuring it by how at peace I felt when I stood still. The shift didn't go unnoticed. By the end of that week, the tone around me had changed. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough to feel the tension settling where comfort used to live. My daughter stopped calling every other day. When she did call, her voice carried caution, like someone approaching a conversation they weren't sure they could control anymore. One afternoon, my son-in-law called. That almost never happened. "Hey," he said, "just wanted to check in." I waited. "We're trying to understand what's going on," he continued. "You've always been the steady one." Steady, reliable, predictable. "I still am," I said, "just not in the same way." He cleared his throat. "You know everyone loves you." I didn't respond to that. Love had never been the issue. Visibility was. Later that day, I ran into my neighbor while bringing in groceries. She's around my age, widowed, observant. "Haven't seen your grandkids in a while," she said gently. "No," I replied. "I haven't." She studied my face. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," I said, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something I had to convince myself of. That evening, my daughter sent a message. Not long, not short. "We miss you." I read it twice. Then I placed my phone down and finished what I was doing. I responded an hour later. "I know." Nothing more. The next morning, I went through my house with fresh eyes, not searching for problems, just noticing the guest room that had quietly become storage for other people's things. The cabinets filled with extra dishes, just in case. The calendar still carrying reminders that no longer applied. I began clearing space. I boxed up toys, clothes, items that had lived there out of habit, not use. I didn't rush. I didn't feel sad. I felt deliberate. In the middle of it, I found an old thank you note my daughter had written me years ago. Crayon handwriting. Misspelled words. Gratitude without conditions. I held it for a moment. Then I placed it back where it belonged. That afternoon, my daughter showed up again. She stood in the doorway longer this time. "You're different," she said. "Yes," I replied. She looked around. "It feels like you're moving on." "I am," I said. "Forward." She sat down slowly. "I didn't realize how much we leaned on you." I waited, and how little we checked if that was okay. That landed differently. "I'm not angry," I said, "but I am aware now." She nodded. "I don't want to lose you." I met her eyes. "Then you'll have to meet me where I am, not where you're used to finding me." She didn't answer right away. When she left, I felt tired, but not drained. There's a difference. That night, I took a walk after dinner. The street was quiet, porch lights on, windows glowing softly, other families inside, living their versions of togetherness. I didn't feel outside of it. I felt adjacent, and that was enough. I realized then that reclaiming yourself doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like consistency, calm, not rushing to fill silence. The people around you either adjust or they reveal themselves. I went to bed knowing something important had happened, not a reconciliation, a recalibration. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would come next if I didn't step back into the role everyone preferred. I was curious, because whatever came next would include me, fully. By the following week, the house felt different. Not emptier, just quieter in a way that didn't ask anything of me. I had fewer messages now, fewer updates about plans I wasn't part of, fewer assumptions about my availability. What remained was space. And in that space, I started noticing how much of my life had been arranged around being useful. On Tuesday, I went to the bank. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm in or demand changes. I simply sat across from a young woman who spoke politely and asked me what I wanted to review. Accounts, automatic transfers, long-standing arrangements I'd set up years ago and never questioned. As she went through the list, I nodded. Some of those transfers no longer made sense. We made adjustments. Small ones. Reasonable ones. Nothing anyone else would notice immediately. But I would. Walking back to my car, I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just alignment. That afternoon, my daughter called again. Shorter than before. "I heard you went to the bank," she said. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated. "Is everything okay?" "It is," I said. Another pause. "You didn't tell us you were making changes." "I didn't need to," I replied. She didn't argue. She couldn't. That evening, I cooked dinner and ate slowly. I thought about how often I'd managed details so others wouldn't have to. How quietly that responsibility had grown into expectation. When generosity becomes automatic, people stop seeing the person behind it. Later that night, I opened a drawer and took out an envelope I'd been meaning to revisit. Inside were old receipts. Notes. A few documents my husband had insisted I keep organized. He'd always said, "One day, you'll need clarity more than kindness." I hadn't understood then. I understood now. The next morning, I received a message from my daughter-in-law. Brief, polite, carefully worded. "We hope you're doing well." I stared at it for a moment before replying. "I am." That was all. No explanation, no reassurance, no opening for negotiation. Over the next few days, I noticed something else shift. Invitations changed. They were no longer assumed, they were offered. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with uncertainty. I accepted some, declined others, without apology. On Saturday, I spent the afternoon doing something I hadn't done in years. Nothing planned. I sat in the backyard with a book I didn't finish. I watched the light move across the fence. I let time pass without filling it. That evening, I realized I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement anymore. I already had it. From myself. For years, I had measured my worth by how much I gave, how reliable I was, how little trouble I caused. That scale had been convenient for everyone else. But it had never been fair to me. Now the equation was different. I wasn't withholding love. I wasn't keeping score. I was simply no longer overextending to maintain balance that only went one way. The family dynamic didn't collapse. It adjusted, and the ones who had benefited most from the old version of me felt that adjustment first. That night, before bed, I wrote one last line in my notebook. Being valued doesn't require being exhausted. I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer. I didn't know exactly what the future would look like. There would be conversations, maybe discomfort, possibly distance. But there would also be something I hadn't felt in a long time. Equilibrium. And as I turned off the light, I knew this much for certain. Whatever came next, it would be built on choice, not obligation. By the time the month began to turn, the consequences of my quiet changes started to surface, not loudly, not all at once, but in small disruptions where routines used to flow without friction. One afternoon, my daughter called in a hurry. I could hear it in her voice before she said anything. "Mom, are you busy?" I looked at the clock. I had nowhere to be. That was no longer the same as being available. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. Papers shuffled on her end. A child's voice in the background. "We're in a bit of a bind," she continued. "The sitter canceled last minute. I waited. And I know you usually help with this, but I can't today," I said. Silence, longer than before. "Oh," she said finally. "Okay." Not angry, just unsettled. After we hung up, I noticed my hands were calm. No guilt, no second guessing. That was new. Later that evening, I received a group message. Plans for the upcoming holiday. A discussion about where to gather. And who would host? Logistics. Someone asked, "Can Mom do the cooking again?" Another message followed quickly. "She might not want to." I read both. I didn't respond. The next day, my daughter-in-law called. She rarely did that directly. "We were just talking," she said carefully, "and we wanted to make sure you didn't feel left out." I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so many decisions had been made for me over the years. "I don't," I said. She hesitated. "You've been quieter lately." "Yes," I replied. "That wasn't a complaint," she added quickly. "I know," I said, and I did. What she didn't say was just as important. They were adjusting, recalculating, realizing that the structure they'd relied on was no longer automatic, and structures don't collapse quietly when their support is removed. They creak. That weekend, I spent time with an old acquaintance from church. We hadn't seen each other in years. We talked about health, about aging, about how families change when expectations go unspoken for too long. At some point, she said, you have to decide if peace is worth the price. I thought about that on the drive home. I had paid that price for years, paid it gladly, until I realized I was the only one paying. On Sunday evening, my daughter stopped by again. This time, she didn't bring her children, just herself. She sat down heavily and looked at her hands. "Things are harder without you stepping in," she admitted. "I know," I said. She looked up. "Is this how it's going to be now?" I considered the question. "This is how it's going to be honest," I said. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She simply nodded as if something had finally clicked into place. After she left, the house felt steady, not tense, not empty, just steady. I realized then that my silence had done what explanations never could. It had forced a recalculation, not of love, but of access. That night, I thought about the years I had filled gaps without being asked, smoothed conflicts before they reached the surface, made things easier so others wouldn't have to feel discomfort. Now, discomfort was doing the work, and I let it. because the truth was simple, even if it took decades to see it clearly. Being indispensable had cost me visibility. Being unavailable had given it back. I turned off the lights and went to bed knowing the next phase wouldn't be easy for anyone, but it would be real. And for the first time, that felt like progress. The change became visible in ways no one had anticipated. It wasn't announced, it wasn't discussed, it simply unfolded. A family dinner was canceled because no one volunteered to host. Another was shortened because the food was ordered instead of prepared. Small things on the surface, but underneath them, the absence of a familiar structure was being felt. I heard about it secondhand. A cousin mentioned how different things felt lately. A neighbor asked if I was traveling because they hadn't seen my car at my daughter's house in weeks. I smiled and said I'd been busy, which was true. I had started filling my days with things that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs. Doctor appointments I'd postponed, long walks in the afternoon, lunch with friends I'd said maybe to for years and finally meant yes. The phone still rang, but less often. And when it did, the tone was no longer casual. It carried hesitation now. Awareness. One evening, my daughter called and spoke more slowly than usual. "We're trying to plan the holiday," she said. "It's just harder than we thought." I didn't respond right away. "There are a lot of moving parts," she continued, "and you always knew how to make it work." I looked out the window at the quiet street, lights coming on one by one. "Yes," I said. "I did." She waited. "And now?" she asked. "Now," I replied. "Everyone gets to learn." She didn't sound offended, just tired. That conversation ended without resolution. But it didn't need one. The next week, an invitation arrived. Not assumed, not last minute, proper, thoughtful, with details. I read it carefully. I accepted, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. At the gathering, things felt tentative, polite, like everyone was adjusting to new footing. I wasn't asked to help in the kitchen. No one handed me a list. No one expected me to manage transitions. I noticed how often eyes drifted toward me, checking, measuring. I stayed where I was, present, calm, not filling silence. At one point, my daughter leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay?" "I am," I said, and meant it. Later, as people said their goodbyes, someone thanked me for coming. Not for helping, not for hosting, for coming. That distinction mattered. On the drive home, I thought about how much effort it had taken in the past to hold everything together, how invisible that effort had been, how easily it had been mistaken for ease. What I had removed wasn't love. It was labor. And without that labor, the family had to slow down, coordinate, communicate, consider. Those things take time. They also take respect. Back at home, I sat down with a cup of tea and felt the quiet settle around me again. Not the silence of being excluded, but the peace of not being overextended. I realized something then that surprised me. No one had accused me of changing. They had simply begun adjusting. That told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't being punished. I was being recalibrated into the family in a way that acknowledged my presence instead of consuming it. That night, before bed, I looked at my calendar. It wasn't empty. It was intentional. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Not control, balance. The kind that doesn't require constant giving to maintain. The kind that holds on its own. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, no accusations. Just the three of us sitting at the dining table, the same one where so many decisions had once been made without me. My daughter spoke first, slowly, carefully. "I feel like we lost you for a while," she said. I didn't correct her. "We didn't mean to," she added. "It just happened." I folded my hands on the table and waited. My daughter-in-law nodded in agreement. "We assumed you'd tell us if something was wrong." I looked at both of them before answering. "I did," I said, "just not with words." They exchanged a glance. "I didn't want to argue," I continued. "I didn't want apologies. I wanted to understand where I stood." My daughter frowned slightly. "You've always been family." "Yes," I said, "but I was treated like infrastructure." That landed differently. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, reflective. "I didn't realize how much we leaned on you," my daughter said finally, "or how little we asked what that cost you." I nodded once. "I didn't realize it either, until I stopped." My daughter-in-law spoke next. "The ring, the cruise, that wasn't meant to compare." "I know," I said, But comparison isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's just visible. No one argued with that. The conversation didn't end with promises. No one vowed to change overnight. That wasn't necessary. What mattered was that something had been named. Before they left, my daughter asked quietly, "So what happens now?" I stood up and began clearing the table. A simple movement, familiar. "Now," I said, "we keep going, just differently." She watched me for a moment. "And if we fall back into old habits, then I'll notice sooner," I replied. That was enough. After they left, I didn't feel relief. I felt steadiness, like a door had been closed properly instead of left ajar. There it is. The next few days were calm, normal in a new way. Calls came without urgency. Invitations came without assumptions. I was asked, not expected. I answered honestly. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Both felt equally allowed. One afternoon, my daughter called just to talk. No requests, no updates, just conversation. It felt lighter, less strategic. "I didn't know how much pressure we put on you," she said at one point. "I didn't either," I replied. That was the truth. Pressure accumulates quietly, especially when you're proud of being capable. That evening, I sat alone with my thoughts and realized something important. The confrontation I had feared never came. What came instead was recognition. Not dramatic, not tearful, but real. I wasn't restored to an old role. I was seen in a new one, and that mattered more. Before bed, I wrote a final note in my notebook. Being heard doesn't always require raising your voice. I closed it and placed it back in the drawer where the keychain still rested, forgotten and insignificant. The object that once symbolized dismissal now meant nothing at all. And that, more than any apology, felt like resolution. I turned off the light, knowing the story wasn't over. Families don't change in a single conversation, but I had changed. And that was permanent. The next chapter wouldn't be about being overlooked. It would be about being present, without disappearing. And for the first time, that balance felt possible. The weeks that followed settled into something steady. Not perfect, not effortless, but honest. I began seeing my family less often, and when I did, it was by choice. Invitations came with pauses now, not assumptions. Questions replaced expectations. I noticed the difference immediately. So did they. On a quiet Saturday morning, I hosted breakfast for the first time in months. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just pancakes and coffee. No pressure, no performance. My daughter arrived with her children, nothing in her hands except a bag of oranges she'd picked up on the way. She looked around my kitchen like she was seeing it for the first time in a while. "Do you want help?" she asked. I smiled. "You can sit." She did. We talked about ordinary things. School, weather, a neighbor's new dog. No one rushed. No one waited for me to direct the moment. When it was time to eat, we all sat down together. Not because I made it happen, because it happened. Later, after they left, I washed the dishes slowly and realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel tired. For years, family time had drained me because it required effort that went unseen. Now it felt lighter, not because I was doing less, but because I wasn't carrying everything alone. That night, I took the keychain out of the drawer one last time. It no longer felt symbolic. It was just an object. Cheap, forgettable. I placed it in the trash and didn't look back. The ring. The cruise. The imbalance that once cut so sharply, they no longer held power over me. They were part of the story, not the meaning of it. What mattered was what came after. I had stopped explaining myself, stopped justifying my limits, stopped smoothing discomfort before it had a chance to teach anything. And in doing so, I gave everyone else the opportunity to rise. Some did. Some struggled. That was no longer mine to manage. One afternoon, my daughter called and said something simple. "I didn't realize how much space you gave us," she said, "until it wasn't there." I didn't respond right away. "Space," I said finally, "isn't absence. It's respect." She didn't argue. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of my life. I joined a walking group, took a short trip on my own, rediscovered mornings that belonged only to me. I wasn't lonely. I was present. Looking back now, I understand that Mother's Day wasn't the moment everything broke. It was the moment everything became clear. Clarity is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply shows you where you stand. For a long time, I stood where I was needed. Now I stand where I am valued. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love that requires self-erasure isn't love. And generosity without boundaries isn't kindness. It's disappearance. I didn't disappear anymore. I stayed, fully. And in doing so, I taught my family something I had never said out loud, that a mother's worth is not measured by how much she gives up, but by how whole she remains. That understanding didn't come with applause. It came with peace. And that was enough.